Thank you, Maeve, and good morning, everybody. I'm John Barry, Professor of Green Political Economy and co-director of the Centre for Sustainability, Equality and Climate Action and co-chair of the Belfast Climate Commission. I'd like to begin with giving a thanks and an apologies. I'd like to thank Joe Ireland, who I have the pleasure of being his co-supervisor for his PhD, for coming up with this idea and the Geological Survey of Northern Ireland. And apologies to Maeve. What I'm going to be presenting is in part a paper I've yet to submit to Maeve as part of the energy strategy. It'll be with you before Christmas as a present, Maeve, I promise. Trust me, I'm a recovering politician. I want to pick up on what Ian and Jenny were saying about the importance of narrative and storytelling, because I think that's part of what the climate change issue has suffered from. What is the story? It's either an apocalyptic one, very negative. I think we have to recognize that part of the reason why we're here today is because of the upsurge of social mobilization, whether it's the young people striking for climate, Extinction Rebellion, more people getting tuned into this issue because of Sir David Attenborough. And there's been a whole set of issues that have come together. But I'm particularly concerned as an educator that many of the students that I teach, some of them are quite anxious about the future around the whole climate issue. And those of us with children, I think, have a particular sensitivity to this issue. So I really welcome, the fact that we're looking at something positive, in terms of geothermal, which has been a bit like the Cinderella in terms of the energy transition, has not been as prominent as perhaps it should be. So I think that's an important issue that we need to consider, of promoting this as a positive suggestion, a positive ask of our communities, our policymakers and businesses. My own view is that we are facing a planetary emergency. So it's not just issues around the climate, but it's also the ecological crisis we're going through. We are now experiencing the 6th great mass extinction across the planet, 1 million species on the threat of extinction, which we shouldn't forget about. And my own view in terms of storytelling and framing and narrative, I'm more comfortable with calling what we're facing now climate breakdown, a climate emergency, a climate crisis, because calling it climate change is like calling an invading army unwelcome guest. I think it singularly doesn't call out the urgency and the action that we need to take on this issue. I also think as a social scientist, but I do know some of the laws of thermodynamics, which makes me rather unique in my faculty, we are going to need much more integrated interdisciplinary research, as both Ian and indeed Jenny was pointing out. I'd like to put out there for those of you who are interested to look up that what we're going to need on the energy transition is much more socio-technical analysis. How do we integrate behavioral change, designing policy, as well as dealing with technological innovation, including how do we upstream public involvement in the technological changes that we're going to make, or indeed in terms of upstreaming and involving and co-creating, as Ian said, policy around this space, in part because that's where we may get some good solutions. But much more than that, it's about the legitimacy of any energy transition. Many of you will be familiar with the idea of a social license to operate, particularly around energy extraction or indeed business, operation. My fear, in part, is to see what happened in France a few years ago when there was an imposition of a carbon tax, and it led to the Gilets jaunes protests where people were out on the street. We want people to be supporting this energy transition. So that's really a crucial issue of co-creation and of getting public buy-in, or what in the just transition discourse is called the social dialogue. We need to have a wide-ranging social dialogue with all sectors of society, because what we're facing is unprecedented in terms of the challenges and opportunities that we're facing to address the energy transition as a way of overcoming our planetary crisis. I do think we're at the beginning of the end of the age of fossil fuels. Whether it's net zero by 2050, as the UK has, or indeed if it's net zero by 2045, as the climate change bill that's going through the Assembly is arguing, and indeed as the Scottish Parliament has proposed. I think we also need to think in terms of, again, issues of framing, is that we should stop calling fossil fuels and calling fossil resources. There's a lot more non-energy uses, particularly for oil. So an important part of this transition, I think, is about properly naming and understanding the resources that we have, we can do a lot more cool stuff with oil, coal, and gas, perhaps, than we are if we just simply burn them, causing carbon dioxide emissions. I would also make the point, particularly for those of you based in Northern Ireland, and on the back of the UK government's climate change committee on Wednesday of its 6th carbon budget, we are also at the beginning of the end of the age of intensive livestock production. It is clear that one of our unique features on this island actually is the high amount of greenhouse gas emissions that we get from agriculture, and that's going to have to be part of the issue. And can geothermal help with the just transition in rural areas? So as well as paying farmers, for example, to sequester carbon by re-wetting bogs or growing more trees, are there geothermal opportunities for our rural communities to move away from an unsustainable intensive livestock and export orientated farming system, and to move them more into the energy space and so on? That's something I think that is really exciting about today's event. And I do think that we have to build back better. Even the Bell Boris Johnson is now using this phrase, and we've had the UK government's 10-point plan for building back better. But where I would differ with the Prime Minister, as I would on a lot of things with him, for those of you who know my own politics, is that building back better means building back differently. It's not about returning to the BC economy, the before COVID economy, or indeed it should not be seen as what I call biofueling the Hummer, that somehow all we got to do is switch from a certain quantum of carbon energy and then replace that then with a renewable or low carbon source. My own view is that building back differently is about changing many aspects of our society. The reality is the pandemic has revealed quite significant weaknesses in our economy. It's only when the tide goes out do you know who's naked. And I think the pandemic has revealed serious weaknesses of inequality. For example, in our key workers, as we now call them, in the health service, in the care sector, in the retail sector, these people were very low paid on precarious contracts. And I think, again, that importance of the social dimension, that we should present the energy transition as part of a package of more or less the wholesale restructuring of our economy to make it more inclusive, make it low carbon, regenerative. And that's what I mean by building back better is indeed building back differently. So let's not return to normal. Normal was the problem. Normal was ecocidal. Normal was inequality producing. And so therefore we have to see that the just energy transition also is not just to do as it normally is viewed in terms of extraction of fossil fuels and what we're going to do with displaced, Aberdeen oil workers, for example. That's really important. And I applaud Scotland for, I think, being the world's first to set up a just transition commission. And I do think we're going to have serious discussions here in Northern Ireland about whether or not we need one as well, particularly for our rural communities that I mentioned a moment ago. But to pick up on something Jenny said, we're going to have to see that a just transition has to be for consumers. It's a pity Jenny's gone, because I'd like to debate the fact that Jenny said there was 20% of households in Northern Ireland in fuel poverty. What that means, colleagues, is that our people spending 10% or more of their income just to keep warm. If you go onto the Department of the Community's website, as I did while Jenny was speaking, it's 42%. So somewhere between a fifth and 40% of our community in Northern Ireland is facing the horrible prospect that when it's really cold, do they heat or eat? And I think if geothermal and the just energy transition is addressing those significant issues of fuel poverty, that gets political legitimacy, that gets social buy-in, so that people don't see that addressing climate change is a sacrifice. It's about the multiple co-benefits we can gain from the energy transition, and particularly geothermal energy in particular. Because I do think that perhaps in a way that hydrogen wasn't really a prominent part of the energy piece a few years ago, and now it's absolutely central. And again, to big up Northern Ireland, we are developing world-leading technology, particularly around heavy goods vehicles, and Wrightbus and Ballymena of developing hydrogen buses. The way hydrogen now is a much more significant part of our energy discussions, I think perhaps geothermal might have the same potential in terms of being a much bigger part of our portfolio of renewable energies we need going forward. Because part of the advantages of geothermal is that not only is it low carbon, but it's also enhances energy security. You know, the more you depend on imported fossil fuels, the more energy insecure you are. It also would mean, because I'm a political scientist, we would have less oil wars like we did in the war in Iraq in 2003. So the transition to a renewable energy future, I think, has another benefit in reducing geopolitical tensions and reduces, you know, things like oil wars in the future. So I do think that geothermal should be absolutely seen as part, not just of the energy strategy, hat tip to Maeve and our colleagues, but also the wider piece around building back better, you know, laying down the foundations for the different type of economy and society for Northern Ireland. So I do think that it's inevitable that we will now make this transition to a renewable energy economy. What's not inevitable, colleagues, is how just that's going to be, how fair it will be. We cannot have the energy transition on the backs of the poor, the vulnerable, particularly in the context of a pandemic. So it's really important to design policy, compensation measures for displaced oil workers, or indeed for hard-pressed consumers. And therefore, in your discussions this morning, I think you need to consider how those social dimensions of any geothermal use needs to be factored into our thinking. So I do think, as I said, that the future is bright, the future is green, but we have to design policy, Jenny, Arlene, Michelle, and Edwin. These are our ministers here who I think have the most responsibility to setting in place the policy platform. And one of those, at least we see some movement on now, is that we're the only part of these islands at the moment in Northern Ireland that doesn't have legislative demands in terms of carbon reduction and climate action. So I think a climate change bill is absolutely a central part of driving this. And it's part of that, to go back to where I started, of seeing that the policy dimensions are really important, because properly designed policy and regulation can drive innovation, as opposed to being a drag, as it's often, I think, mistakenly understood. So my own view, just to finish, is let's make no small plans around the energy transition. We need to excite people. And it's almost, you know, to paraphrase the wonderful Scottish novelist Alistair Gray, who, if you've not read him, absolutely, you know, fill your boots. He's absolutely a wonderful author in this area. And he had a wonderful phrase. He said, we should be presenting this energy transition as if we're in the early days of building better societies. So we have to see this not just as a biofueling the Hummer, that we're simply changing the energy system, but it's much bigger. It's part of a fundamental, you know, reset, if you like, of our entire economies and societies. So let's make no small plans, because they don't have the power to inspire. This is not simply a dry technical policy issue. This is a new green industrial revolution with all the changes and excitements that requires. So thanks very much for listening. I wish you all the best for the rest of the day. I've got to head off and in a bit to corrupt the minds of the young, otherwise known as teaching.